Dear listener, when the Muslims migrated from Makkah to Medina, they did not arrive as conquerors. They arrived as refugees. They left behind homes, businesses, inheritance, and familiarity. Many walked away with nothing but faith. Quraysh had not only persecuted them, they had confiscated their wealth. Shops were seized, houses were occupied, assets were redistributed among enemies. The migration was not strategic retreat, it was survival. In Medina, the believers began rebuilding from scratch. The Muhajirun, those who migrated, were paired with the Ansar, the helpers of Medina. Brotherhood replaced bloodline. Faith replaced tribe. But emotionally and economically, the community was fragile. They were surrounded by threats. Quraysh in Makkah burned with anger. Jewish tribes within Medina observed cautiously. Hypocrites began emerging quietly. The Muslims were no longer an isolated minority, they were a rising presence. And rising presences invite confrontation. Quraysh could not tolerate the idea that Islam had survived. They believed pressure would extinguish it. Instead, it relocated and strengthened. Trade caravans traveling between Makkah and Syria became symbols of the wealth stolen from the believers. The Muslims saw those caravans not only as economic opportunity, but as partial recovery of what had been taken from them unjustly. This was not greed, it was a restoration. A large caravan led by Abu Sufyan was returning from Syria, carrying significant goods. It represented the economic backbone of Quraysh. The Prophet and his companions aimed to intercept it, not to provoke war, but to reclaim a portion of what had been seized. The Muslims were not preparing for a full military confrontation. They were lightly equipped, not mobilized for large-scale battle. Yet tension was rising beneath the surface. Quraysh, informed of possible interception, mobilized rapidly. They gathered an army nearly 1,000 strong, well-equipped, armored, confident. Their goal extended beyond protecting a caravan. They wanted to demonstrate dominance. They wanted to crush the Muslims publicly and permanently. Contrast defines this moment. On one side stood a community barely re-established, still grieving loss, limited in resources. On the other stood an experienced force backed by wealth, numbers, and pride. The Muslims numbered approximately 313 men. They possessed only a few horses and limited armor. Many shared camels. Some had little more than faith and determination. But something deeper had changed. The migration to Medina had transformed belief into structure. It was no longer individual faith, it was communal identity. The believers were not defending territory alone, they were defending revelation. As news reached Medina that Quraysh had mobilized fully, reality settled in. This would not be a caravan interception, this would be a confrontation, and not equal confrontation, but disproportionate. 313 versus 1,000. To human calculation, the outcome seemed predictable. Experience favored Quraysh, equipment favored Quraysh, numbers overwhelmingly favored Quraysh. But history does not always submit to arithmetic. The Muslims stood at a crossroads. Retreat would signal weakness. Engagement would risk annihilation. Yet for the believers, the question was not simply strategic, it was spiritual. If they turned away now, what message would that send? If they stood firm, even against overwhelming odds, what would that affirm? The community in Medina was on the brink, not merely of battle, but of definition. Badr would not only test their strength, it would reveal whether reliance on Allah was rhetoric or reality. And in that tension, history prepared to shift. The initial objective seemed limited. The Prophet and his companions set out with the intention of intercepting Abu Sufyan's caravan returning from Syria. It was a strategic move, measured, practical, and justified. The wealth in that caravan represented assets taken unjustly from the Muhajirun when they were forced to leave Makkah. Recovering even a portion of it would stabilize the fragile economy of Medina. The Muslims did not march as a fully mobilized army. They were lightly armed, expecting minimal resistance. Many did not even anticipate combat. This was not planned as a decisive military encounter, it was calculated recovery. Yet events were already shifting beyond their expectations. Abu Sufyan, experienced and cautious, received intelligence about possible interception. He immediately altered his route along the coastal path and sent urgent word to Makkah. His message was clear: "Your caravan is in danger. Mobilize." Quraysh responded not with caution, but with fury. Within days, nearly 1,000 soldiers assembled. The armor was polished, swords sharpened, war drums echoed across Makkah. The elite leaders of Quraysh joined personally: Abu Jahl, Utbah, Shayba, and others who had long opposed the Prophet. This was no longer about protecting trade, it became about crushing Islam. They saw it as an opportunity to end the rising presence in Medina permanently. Here lies the turning point. The caravan escaped safely. Abu Sufyan sent word that the goods were secure and that the army could return. For some, that should have ended the mission. But arrogance does not retreat easily. Abu Jahl insisted they proceed to Badr anyway. "We will go to Badr," he declared. "Stay for 3 days, slaughter camels, drink wine, and let the Arabs hear of our strength." It was a show of dominance, a message to every tribe. Quraysh remains supreme. Contrast sharpens dramatically here. The Muslims were preparing for limited engagement. Quraysh marched for spectacle and intimidation. One side sought justice, the other sought pride. One moved cautiously, the other moved confidently, almost arrogantly. When news reached the Prophet that a 1,000-strong army was advancing, the atmosphere shifted immediately. This was no longer a caravan interception, it was a confrontation. A full-scale clash was now inevitable. The Prophet gathered his companions for consultation. He did not impose a decision unilaterally. He sought their counsel. The Muhajirun pledged loyalty. Then the Ansar spoke, despite not being originally obligated to fight outside Medina. Sa'ist di ibn Mu'tijadih radiyallahu anhu stood and declared that if the Prophet commanded them to enter the sea, they would follow without hesitation. Their unity was sealed. The caravan that escaped safely had already fulfilled its role. It forced Quraysh into a battle they thought they controlled. It pushed the Muslims into a defining moment they had not planned. What began as economic recovery had transformed into historical confrontation. The path toward Badr was no longer optional. It was written. And the valley that awaited them would soon witness a battle where numbers would lose meaning and sincerity would determine outcome. When the Muslims arrived near Badr, the reality of their situation settled heavily upon them. They were not facing a small escort guarding a caravan. They were facing a fully mobilized army from Makkah, nearly 1,000 men, equipped with horses, armor, and experienced fighters. In contrast, the believers numbered only around 313. They had 2 horses, a few swords, limited shields. Many shared camels for transportation. By every visible standard, the imbalance was overwhelming. But Badr was not merely about equipment, it was about conviction. The Prophet surveyed the terrain carefully. Strategy still mattered. He accepted the advice of Hubab ibn al-Mundhir, radiyallahu anhu, to move closer to the wells of Badr, securing access to water while limiting Quraysh's advantage. Even in moments of reliance on Allah, practical planning was not abandoned. Faith and strategy walked together. As they prepared camp, the emotional weight of the confrontation intensified. Some companions quietly reflected on the possibility of death. Many faced relatives among the opposing army, fathers, uncles, cousins. This was not distant warfare. It was intimate. The Valley of Badr would force choices that cut through blood ties. Contrast sharpened in every direction. Quraysh marched with confidence, drums beating, convinced victory was guaranteed. The Muslims stood in quiet focus, aware of their vulnerability. Quraysh had steel and numbers. The Muslims had belief and unity. One side trusted superiority, the other trusted promise. The Prophet organized the ranks carefully. He straightened lines with his own hands, emphasizing discipline even among limited forces. Leadership at Badr was not a distant command, it was presence. He knew the weight of what they faced. He knew that defeat here could crush the young Muslim community entirely. And yet something remarkable filled the air, not panic but clarity. The companions did not complain about numbers. They did not retreat at the sight of the army. Instead, they expressed readiness. Miqdad ibn Amr, radiallahu anh, spoke words that echoed strength. "We will not say to you what the children of Israel said to Musa, 'Go you and your Lord and fight.' Rather, we will fight by your side." That declaration separated Badr from history's other battles. This was not a reluctant participation, it was chosen for loyalty. The Quran would later describe the believers at Badr as weak in worldly measure, yet strengthened by divine support. The imbalance was intentional. It revealed whether faith was conditional upon advantage or independent of it. Night approached. Fires flickered across the valley. Quraysh rested in apparent superiority. The Muslims rested in cautious hope. The number 313 stood against 1,000, not merely in bodies, but in belief versus pride. Badr was about to prove that strength measured by arithmetic does not always determine outcome. Sometimes, 313 hearts anchored in Tawheed outweigh 1,000 swords sharpened by arrogance. And the dawn would make that difference undeniable. As darkness settled over the valley of Badr, tension thickened in the air. The two forces rested within sight of one another, separated by distance, yet bound by inevitability. Fires flickered on both sides, but the atmosphere was different. In the camp of Quraysh, confidence prevailed. They laughed, celebrated, and spoke of the victory they assumed was certain. In the camp of the believers, silence carried weight. This was not a night of arrogance, it was a night of reflection. The Prophet withdrew to a small shelter constructed for him. There he turned to Allah with intensity rarely witnessed. He raised his hands and supplicated with urgency. "O Allah, if this group is destroyed, you will not be worshipped on this earth." His voice trembled. His hands remained lifted until his cloak fell from his shoulders. Abu Bakr radiallahu anh stood beside him, reassuring him, saying that Allah would fulfill his promise. This moment defines Badr more than swords ever could. Before the clash of steel, there was reliance. Before movement on the battlefield, there was submission in prayer. The Prophet did not depend on numbers or positioning alone. He depended on Allah completely. Contrast sharpened as the night unfolded. Quraysh trusted preparation and superiority. The Muslims trusted the promise. Quraysh slept comfortably in confidence. The believers alternated between rest and remembrance. Then came rain. The sky opened gently over the valley. For the believers it brought calmness and purification. The sand beneath their feet hardened, making movement easier. Hearts that carried tension softened with reassurance. The Quran describes how Allah sent down rain to cleanse them and strengthen their footing. What could have been inconvenience became mercy. On the side of Quraysh, however, the rain complicated movement. Their ground became heavier, discomfort crept into their preparations. The same rain fell, yet its effect differed. This is the nature of divine support. It shifts outcomes subtly before confrontation even begins. As the night deepened, sleep descended upon the believers, not heavy slumber, but peaceful rest. A tranquility from Allah settled their hearts. Fear that might have paralyzed them dissipated. The Quran describes this state as security sent from Him. Even before the first strike of battle, victory began forming internally. Meanwhile, Quraysh remained unaware of the spiritual shift unfolding. Their calculations were based on visible advantage. They saw 1,000 against 313. They saw horses against limited mounts. They saw armor against simple garments. They did not see angels being prepared. They did not hear prayers being answered. The night before, Badr was not empty. It was decisive. It separated reliance from arrogance. It revealed whose strength rested on material advantage and whose strength rested on divine support. When dawn approached, both sides would rise. But only one side had already secured what mattered most, the help of Allah. Dawn broke over the valley of Badr, and the two forces stood face to face. The desert air carried a tension heavier than armor. On one side stood nearly 1,000 men of Quraysh, experienced warriors, confident and well-equipped. On the other stood 313 believers, limited in number, limited in resources, but anchored in faith. The imbalance was visible to every eye, but what was invisible would soon define the outcome. The battle began with individual duels, as was the custom of the Arabs. From Quraysh stepped Utbah, Shayba and Walid, leaders of prestige and experience. From the Muslim ranks emerged Hamza, radiallahu an, Ali, radiallahu an, and Ubaidah, radiallahu an. The clash was swift and intense. Within moments, the leaders of Quraysh lay defeated. The symbolic blow was immediate. The men who carried pride into the battlefield fell at its very start. But the confrontation did not end there. As full engagement began, the Prophet took a handful of dust and cast it toward the enemy ranks, saying, "May their faces be disfigured." The Quran later affirmed that it was not merely his throw, but Allah who cast it. Even the smallest gesture, when aligned with divine will, carries power beyond calculation. Then comes what no army anticipates, support from the unseen. The Quran speaks clearly of angels descending to assist the believers. Thousands were sent as reinforcement. This was not a metaphor, it was an intervention. The believers later testified to witnessing unfamiliar riders striking the enemy. Fear spread through the ranks of Quraysh as confusion replaced certainty. Contrast exploded across the battlefield. Quraysh saw only 313 when they marched. They did not see the help descending from the heavens. The believers felt something shift, confidence strengthened, resolve intensified. The numerical disadvantage no longer defined them. Abu Jahl, the fiercest opponent of Islam, fell that day. The man who once declared himself defender of Quraysh's pride was struck down. Leadership collapsed quickly. When arrogance loses its voice, armies falter. The organized ranks of Quraysh began to scatter. Panic replaced formation. Confidence dissolved into retreat. The battle ended in decisive victory for the Muslims. 70 of Quraysh were killed, 70 were captured. The empire that came to intimidate returned humiliated. The valley that seemed destined for Muslim defeat became the site of divine triumph. But Badr was not victorious through strength alone. It was victory through reliance. The Quran reminds believers that Allah granted them victory while they were weak. The message was unmistakable. Numbers do not determine outcome. Sincerity does. The descent of angels was not merely battlefield reinforcement, it was confirmation. It affirmed that when faith stands firm, help arrives from directions unseen. The clash of swords ended, the dust settled, but Badr did more than win a battle. It shifted the balance of Arabia forever, and it proved that 313 hearts connected to Tawheed outweigh 1,000 swords sharpened by pride. The Battle of Badr was not simply a military encounter buried in history. It was a moment that redefined how victory is measured. On paper, 313 should not defeat 1,000. Logic favored Quraysh. Experience favored Quraysh. Equipment favored Quraysh. Yet the outcome overturned every visible calculation. Badr stands as a permanent reminder that strength detached from Allah is fragile, and weakness connected to Him is powerful. For the early Muslim community, Badr was survival. Had they been defeated decisively, the young state in Medina could have collapsed. The enemies surrounding them would have intensified attacks. Hypocrites would have gained confidence. Islam might have remained isolated, but Allah chose that valley as the place where belief would be validated publicly. Contrast defines its lesson. Quraysh marched to display dominance. They planned a celebration at Badr, music, food, and pride. They sought reputation among the tribes. The Muslims marched without certainty of return. They sought only the pleasure of Allah. One side wanted to be seen as powerful, the other wanted to be accepted by their Lord. The Qur'an describes Badr as the day of criterion, the day truth and falsehood were separated clearly. It was not merely a clash of armies, it was a clash of foundations, pride versus humility, strategy versus reliance, numbers versus sincerity. And this is why Badr still matters. Modern struggles often appear overwhelming. Communities may feel outnumbered, out-resourced, or outmatched. Challenges rise in forms political, social, and personal. The story of Badr shifts perspective. Victory is not always tied to visible advantage. Sometimes it is tied to purity of intention and trust in Allah. The Prophet did not ignore preparation. He organized ranks, he consulted companions, he positioned strategically. But his greatest weapon that night was dua. His greatest strength was reliance. The rain that fell, the sleep that calmed hearts, the angels that descended, these were not coincidences. They were responses to sincerity. Badr also dismantles arrogance. Quraysh believed experience guaranteed success. They assumed numbers would intimidate, but arrogance blinds judgment. They underestimated a community bonded by faith. They miscalculated the power of Tawheed. The lesson is timeless. When believers measure themselves solely by material capacity, fear grows. When they measure themselves by connection to Allah, clarity grows. Badr teaches that divine support is not automatic. It accompanies sincerity, unity, and trust. The Valley of Badr still exists physically, but its true impact lies beyond geography. It lives in every moment where faith stands against odds. It lives in every heart that feels small before overwhelming pressure, yet chooses reliance over retreat. 313 against 1,000 was not just history, it was a declaration. When Allah is your ally, numbers lose authority. And that reality has not changed.